The Eurozone crisis has paralysed Spain. Greece is staring into the abyss. While Britain is not a member, the British economy is closely linked to the Eurozone bloc. So how would a collapse in the single currency impact on the UK? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Prime Minister David Cameron has warned that Britain faces perilous times. He's pledged to more spending cuts to keep Britain safe from the storm, as he put it. But will the public accept more cutbacks? Well, before we find out what they think, here's a short video clip.
The Eurozone crisis has reached boiling point, and the prospect of Greece leaving the single currency union threatens to trigger a much broader collapse of the European economy. Economic activity in the Eurozone fell at its fastest rate for 3 years in May. Official figures show that retail sales in the region stand 2.5% lower than last year. If Greece defaults, British banks will lose billions of pounds. This will make loans for both high street customers and businesses more expensive and difficult to get, creating another credit crunch and stunting economic growth. Already Britain is feeling the effects of the Eurozone crisis, with the value of UK assets making a loss of £470 billion in the last year. As well as higher borrowing costs, people are facing a fall in the value of their homes. A report from Capital Economics, a research consultancy group, estimated that the total value of household assets has fallen by around 2.5%. That means that the average British household is £18,000 worse off. Spending on big-ticket items such as cars has fallen, but households have also cut back on their weekly food shop. Economists had hoped that UK exports would grow this year to offset the weakness of domestic demand. But 40% of Britain's exports go to the Eurozone countries. With the UK exporting more to Spain and Italy than it does to China, the crisis in those countries would hold back the UK economy for years. If the Eurozone collapses, a spectre of chaos across the continent is expected. Member countries would create new currencies, most of which would be pegged proportionately lower against the British pound than the euro is now. This would make British goods more expensive and the volume of UK exports would fall. The loss in the value of assets held by British banks, which includes the sale of insurance and other guarantees on debt default, could create such losses as to warrant a bailout of the UK financial sector. The British public is already angry and frustrated with the tax hikes, high unemployment and welfare cuts. So how much further would they need to make cutbacks as a result of a Eurozone breakup? And would they be able to? The Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, is warning of the extremism and xenophobia that could follow a collapse. With suggestions that the UK might be facing a decade-long recession, could the effects of a Eurozone collapse lead to a much broader political upheaval?
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking people what they know about the crisis in Greece and a possible collapse in the Eurozone. And also, how might that collapse affect Britain?
They owe a lot of money in debts and that, and they're considering coming out of the Eurozone.
How much do you know about the crisis in Greece and the possibility of a collapse of the euro?
What I've seen on the news and read in the newspapers, it's obviously a critical situation for Europe.
Greece got into a lot of trouble because they were sold bad bonds by Goldman Sachs. And ultimately Goldman Sachs sold them the bad bonds, got them into the EU in the first place, then messed them up. So it's been an ongoing problem that's been gestation for the past 10 years or more.
I don't think it looks good for the Eurozone. I think there's a lot of changes that need to take place there. And it's slightly disturbing, but only affects us here, I think, in a very slight manner, in a slight way.
How much do you know about events in Greece and the possibility that, the Eurozone could collapse?
Only what we read in the papers. There looks a very good chance that Greece will leave the Euro. My opinion, Germany should leave the Euro.
Well, I worked in Greece many years ago. and I suppose I know that it's a nation that's not taking care of its finances very well.
How do you think a collapse in the Eurozone might affect Britain?
Well, I think it'll be very bad for Britain, because most of our trade is done with the European Union, so it will not be good at all. And I think a lot of people could suffer, and the economy in Britain could suffer.
Well, I suppose everything will go up. You know, we'll probably have to put more money into the Eurozone. I'm hoping we pull out.
Well, I think trade-wise it's going to affect us, and it may affect us in the value of the pound, our savings and long-term country's economy. So I think it's quite a serious matter, really.
How might a collapse in the euro then affect Britain? I mean, obviously we've got the pound.
Well, we've got the pound, but unfortunately we do so much trade with Europe now that it's bound to affect us. It'll affect the world, but it's got to happen. Greece will not be able to stay within the euro. It's clear, you know, many years ago that this would all go completely pear-shaped, and sure enough it has.
I think it might feed through into the banking sector. I think probably not Greece on its own, but if you get contagion into Spain and Italy and Portugal, then there may well be an impact after that, which may hit some of the banks. I'm not quite sure what their exposures are, and they've been reducing them, but you may have a problem.
Well, the views there of people here on the streets of London. But what do our experts have to say?
The question of Greece and the Eurozone collapse starts with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. At the Maastricht Treaty, Denmark and Britain opted out of the single currency. That is where the single currency starts, and that is part of the single European market. Germany wanted a single market, a single currency, and also a single European army. They've got the single market, which Britain is part of, and this single currency, we forecast all along that it would not work, because if you take away the right of a nation state or a government to control its economy, for instance, it does have no control over the exchange rates and interest rates. They're controlled by the European Central Bank. The criteria put in place by the Maastricht Treaty includes limit on public sector spending, on borrowing, and those limits were quite strict, and Germany and France were the first two countries to break these rules, and hence started the collapse or the crisis of the Eurozone. And Greece is just one of the first countries to get into serious trouble because of this, and because Germany's economy is the strongest, can easily export. Other countries out around Germany, especially in southern Europe, can't export and import into Germany. They get into a worse and worse situation. So to accuse the Greeks, as is happening, that they're lazy is a complete incorrect analysis of the situation. As far as austerity here is concerned and the impacts on Britain is concerned, this government has said that it wants the Eurozone to continue and that they should get together in a more European Union, more Eurofederalism. Now if that's to happen and more austerity is imposed, then it makes the single market even more difficult to work in, more difficult to export to, and all the rest of it. Therefore Britain's economy will be suffering, and if this government continues to impose more austerity and all the policies are not yet in place, then the situation here will get worse economically and politically.
I don't think that the UK will be spared the negative consequences of a possible but not likely collapse of the Eurozone. But if this did happen, then the UK would be suffering in terms of, first of all, its financial sector. The UK economy remains heavily exposed, heavily dependent on banks and the banking sector, so that would suffer the consequences. And secondly, the whole economy would suffer because the UK has in the Eurozone one of its main trading partners, and when your trading partner are not doing well, they cannot absorb the products, be they services or goods, that you create and export. So the UK would suffer in both respects. But I also think it would create a kind of instability that nobody wants. The only worst thing that can happen when there is a crisis is to make the crisis even worse. So that's why I think the British government is right to argue, although from the sidelines, in favour of further integration, because that's the real response. In addition to growth-inducing measures, that's the appropriate response to the crisis in the Eurozone. Now, austerity, we now know after, well, 3 to 5 years, depending on how you count, is not the appropriate answer to what is happening in the Eurozone. It's not necessarily the appropriate answer to what is happening in the UK. Some cuts have to take place, but cuts alone, which is what we've had until now, will not give the correct response. As several entrepreneurs will tell you, as several commentators, business people will tell you, what really matters is demand. And to have demand, you need to foster demand, you need to foster growth, you need to foster jobs. If people have money in their pocket, they are more likely to go out and spend it. If they don't have money in the pocket, they will not go out and spend, obviously, what they don't have. So on top of some cuts that in some sectors, at least in some countries, are required, the entire Eurozone and arguably the UK as well need significant effort to create jobs and give hope to people, and then foster some kind of sense of stability and some kind of positive future. Otherwise, if we keep focusing on austerity, the problems will get worse.
One survey has estimated that the average British family is already £18,000 worse off because of the Eurozone crisis. With unemployment so high and already cuts in the welfare state, how much more can people stand, especially the most vulnerable in our society? Could it lead to protests and civil disobedience, or even a much broader upheaval in our economic system? Well, let's find out what the public thinks.
Worse, much worse. Apparently, I don't know why, but I've heard it's going to be quite disastrous. So it seems to be better that Greece doesn't leave the euro. That's, if we can avoid it, that seems to be the...
The British economy is linked very closely to Europe. I mean, 40% of exports, and of course the banks have a lot of their investments there. And it has been estimated that the average British family is now £18,000 worse off. Of course, that's looking at share prices, house prices, and those other things because of what's happened in the euro. Does that surprise you?
It surprises me that is put as the only solution. I mean, certainly the euro has an influence on it, but I don't think that should be taken in isolation. I think our own economics, our own austerity measures and so on are playing a part as well.
I don't believe, I mean, they'll probably use that as a way of trying to justify making them harder. But then again, I also think we need to cut harder anyway, so...
I think it'll get far worse. I can't see it improving at the moment. I can't see the country as a way out. I think it'll get worse.
I don't know, because I don't know how much the British people will put up with, because in the last 2 years it's been pretty tough for us anyway. I mean, I'm actually okay, but I've got friends who've lost jobs, friends who've lost houses. I don't know really how much more they would take. I don't know, we might end up having riots like in the poll tax, you know.
How much worse do you think the austerity measures might get here in Britain?
I'm not too sure, to be honest with you. I'll say, if it's bad at the moment, it can only get worse. I think our saving grace, if anything, is the fact that we're not part of the euro. If not, then we could potentially be suffering. Same with some of the issues that other countries are suffering. So.
I think it's likely with the way things are going at the moment, with the whole ethos being on austerity and punishing the poorest for the crisis, that and cutting public sector jobs and putting more people on dole. In terms of crisis, I think. We saw the riots in London last summer, which were, the trigger was a police shooting at Mark Duggan, but there was a lot of tension in those communities. So it's possible poor people, as we're seeing in Greece now, we're seeing anarchy on the streets, we're seeing massive protests in Spain. I think poor people who have who have nothing to lose, will resort to desperate measures. So it could well get worse, the way things are heading.
I think there'd be more of a social upheaval if there were less cutbacks and our bond rates went up, forcing interest rates up. Things would be a lot worse, actually. So we need the cutbacks.
With unemployment already so high and already been, severe cuts in the welfare system, I mean, how much more can people take? I mean, is there a danger of kind of civil disobedience, kind of rioting that we've seen in Greece, and perhaps even an upheaval in the whole, sort of economic system that we've got?
In Britain, I think we're a long, long way from civil disobedience here. We're not naturally civilly disobedient here anyway. I sometimes think that we could help ourselves by being a little bit more like the French and blocking the ports occasionally or whatever, but I don't think we're in imminent danger of that at the moment.
It's unlikely, but you never know where something like this will go. There's been an incredible period of growth and prosperity for 60 years since the war, and how long can it continue? 3 years ago we would have never thought we'd be where we are now with Greece and the Euro, so it's possible.
Different views there from the public here on the streets of London. Well, let's find out what our experts think.
Nick Clegg's statement, as I just said, that there'll be more xenophobia and social disturbances is part of his threat to say, well, you've got to go along with what we say rather than find a course for Britain which would take Britain outside the EU and get its full independence back and the right to self-determination and a development of proper democracy here with accountability, which is two of the things which we've started to lose a great deal of since we've been members of the European Union and the common market, because that's part of the whole setup, is an attack on the nation state, the rights to governments to control things, including the movement of capital and the movement of people, goods and services. They're the four basic things that the single market brings in, and our government should be able to control these things, and our government should be accountable to us and not to the EU and the Brussels and so on. The only way that could be taken to prevent a Eurozone collapse is the plan that I want to put into place is a full fiscal and political union. If you have a full political and fiscal union, then it will be dominated by Germany in particular, and from the centre in what we've been fighting against all along is a Euro-federalist government where Germany with France dominates the 17 Eurozone countries. If Greece left, then it would be 16, and if they are able to put that in place, they might be able to prevent a collapse, but in the longer run it cannot work because you've got 17 different nation states with different economies, different languages, different histories, different borders, different peoples, and you can't weld all that together, it was always said, under one policy.
We will see a political upheaval, and I do expect the extreme sides of the political spectrum to be strengthened if we keep focusing on austerity. Austerity alone cannot resolve the problem, and people who are getting poorer are also getting more desperate. People who are poor, unemployed and desperate can go for all kinds of populist responses that some segments, the extreme segments of the political spectrum, can offer. There are several things that need to be done, and several things that have been done, and several things that will be done in that respect. The big story about this is further integration. Further integration means all sorts of institutional and policy measures that will bring the 17 countries of the Eurozone closer together, and the 17 countries need to start reacting as one. Up until now, the Eurozone has been built on shaky foundations, in the sense that there was one currency, one bank, one interest rate, but several national budgets, 17 national budgets, 17 national ways of earning money and spending money. This cannot go on forever. We need further integration, which basically means the federalization of the EU. We need the EU to become a federal kind of arrangement with a single Ministry of Finance. alongside the single bank that exists, the central bank that exists. We need to have a closer integration in terms of fiscal policy, social policy, spending across the board, and we need a growth story. And growth stories can only come from actors that think as one, as opposed to trying to compete with each other. So the growth and the institutional growth agenda and the institutional developments have to go hand in hand.
Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg has warned that a collapse in the Eurozone would be an ideal recipe for the increase of extremism and xenophobia. So how concerned should we be, and what could be done to stop it? Let's find out what the public thinks.
I think there's always an excuse for extremism, but I don't think that this would particularly make things any worse than they are. I think people have to live in the real world and get used to the fact that things are changing, and we haven't got the money to spend like we used to have.
Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, though, has warned that there could be an increase in xenophobia and extremism. To some extent, we've seen that in Europe. Do you think that's a danger here? And if so, what can be done to stop that?
Well, I think it's a lot of politicians. I blame the politicians, really, because rather than taking responsibility for the problems that they've caused, I mean, they've created this the euro and the Eurozone, and that's, if you like, and they've run up these debts to very high levels. And as soon as problems come along, it's very easy to point the finger and say, oh, it's the immigrants, or it's some minority group. Sure. It's very easy for someone to come along and say that.
I tend to agree with that comment that he said, yes. I think it's very worrying times for all of us on that.
Oh, you can see it happening. You can see they're called Golden Dawn in Greece. You can see a lot of nationalism in Germany. In the French election, which we've just had, Marine Le Pen did very well. It's a real risk, and politicians must be very honest about trying to dampen that rather than raise populist feelings.
What should be done, in your view, to kind of rescue or maintain the Eurozone, or maintain a kind of prosperity? I mean, what should governments do?
That's a real question. I have no idea really, but what would be really nice is if they stopped being part of the old boys network, which is almost impossible, and actually stopped fudging figures and stopped sort of drip feeding us good news. Let's get to the bottom line. What is actually owed to the banks? What would it take to put it right?
I think Germany and France and the Eurozone have to get together, and they have to make a decision one way or the other and sort this mess out, rather than kicking the can down the road as everyone knows they've been doing.
I suppose the only thing really would be to revalue every European economy, but I'm sure Germany and possibly France wouldn't agree to that.
Well, that's all for this week. Thanks so much for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's all from me. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.